An empire can survive invasion, bankruptcy, plague, even humiliation. But the gravest danger begins when the institutions built to defend order start feeding on the very trust that makes order possible. In the 3rd century crisis, Rome did not simply face enemies at its borders. Rome faced the strategic nightmare of becoming its own most efficient destroyer. By AD 235, the Roman Empire remained a colossal political achievement. Its territory stretched across the Mediterranean world and deep into Europe and the Near East. Its roads, laws, armies, tax systems, and urban networks still conveyed an image of organized permanence unmatched by any rival power. The empire was wealthy by ancient standards, militarily formidable, and psychologically enormous. But grandeur and stability are not the same condition. Rome still possessed scale. What it was beginning to lose was balance. The storm had been gathering long before the famous implosions. The Severan dynasty had strengthened the military as the central pillar of rule. This appeared rational. Emperors lived or died by army loyalty, therefore, the army was rewarded with higher pay, greater political importance, and clearer knowledge of its own leverage. But a state that secures itself by privileging one institution above all others is not solving a problem. It is relocating the problem into the future. Rome increasingly ruled through military patronage rather than broad civic legitimacy, and that meant each succession became less a constitutional transfer than a test of armed persuasion. This shift mattered because Roman imperial government was always a paradox. Officially, the emperor was the guardian of an ancient political order. In practice, the emperor was a monarch whose authority depended upon military recognition, elite cooperation, administrative continuity, and the perception of divine or historical favor. So long as those elements reinforced one another, the empire appeared seamless. But once they drifted apart, the system became structurally volatile. An emperor needed soldiers to rule. Soldiers needed payment to remain loyal. Payment required taxation and confidence in the currency. Taxation required provincial compliance. Compliance required security. Security required armies not distracted by civil war. Every part of the machine depended on every other part. At the same time, the frontiers themselves were changing. Rome had long benefited from facing rivals that were dangerous but fragmented. Along the Rhine and Danube, pressure came from many groups, but those groups were often divided, temporary, and manageable through a blend of diplomacy, punitive expeditions, subsidies, and selective war. In the east, the Parthian Empire had been formidable, but it also operated through a looser aristocratic structure than Rome's own military bureaucracy. But in the 3rd century, old assumptions began to fail. Germanic peoples increasingly formed larger confederated groupings capable of launching raids at greater scale. In Persia, the Sasanian dynasty replaced the Parthians and brought not only military energy but ideological ambition. This was no routine frontier turbulence. Rome was now facing opponents more centralized, more aggressive, and more willing to exploit Roman distraction. The empire's economy was also under mounting strain. Armies were expensive. Frontier defense required constant movement, provisioning, recruitment, equipment, and emergency response. Civil conflict added a further burden because every claimant to the throne had to purchase loyalty quickly. Therefore donatives grew, fiscal pressure intensified, and coinage was increasingly debased. A state can survive debasement for a time. But money is not merely metal. It is a social contract expressed in circulation. When confidence in currency declines, the state does not simply lose purchasing efficiency. It loses credibility. Rome was asking more from its provinces at the precise moment it was proving less able to guarantee the peace that justified those demands. Then disease magnified every weakness. The plague of Cyprian, beginning around AD 249, was not a single dramatic strike but an attritional catastrophe. Its exact nature remains debated, but its strategic consequences are unmistakable. It reduced manpower. It damaged tax revenue. It increased local fear. It eroded social endurance. It made replacement of battlefield losses harder and made every military failure more expensive. Worse still, plague does not merely kill bodies. It injures confidence in the future. In a world already dependent on imperial image, military success, and ritualized legitimacy, disease darkened the psychological atmosphere of the empire. Cities became more anxious, frontiers more brittle, and rulers more desperate for visible demonstrations of control. This was the central nightmare. Rome had to defend multiple frontiers simultaneously while also managing the succession problem of a military monarchy. One emperor could not be everywhere. But any absence could be interpreted as neglect, weakness, or opportunity. If the ruler concentrated on the Rhine, the Danube or East might crack. If the ruler moved east against Persia, Western commanders gained dangerous autonomy. If taxes rose, provincial bitterness grew. If pay faltered, soldiers looked elsewhere for leadership. The empire had become a vast machine for producing emergencies faster than a single center could absorb them. The crisis that followed is often remembered as chaos, a blur of assassinations, usurpers, raids, defeats, and fragmentation. But this was not random madness. It was a rational system producing irrational outcomes. Generals, emperors, provincial elites, and frontier communities were all making understandable decisions inside a structure that rewarded immediate survival over long-term coherence. The tragedy of the age lies precisely here. Many of the actors were not foolish. They were trapped inside incentives that made prudence collectively disastrous. The turning point came with the murder of Severus Alexander in AD 235 and the rise of Maximinus Thrax. His accession signaled far more than a change of ruler. It announced that the frontier army could elevate one of its own with brutal speed and without serious deference to senatorial respectability. Maximinus embodied a new political fact. The purple could be seized through military acclamation by a commander whose authority rested less on traditional elite legitimacy than on direct soldier support. Therefore the logic of succession shifted further away from any pretense of stable constitutional continuity and further toward naked force. For the Senate, this was alarming. For the provinces, it was destabilizing. For the armies, it was clarifying. If emperorship could be made in the camps, then every successful commander existed in a dangerous category: servant, protector, and potential sovereign at once. This was not merely personal ambition inflamed by proximity to power. It was structural temptation. A general on a threatened frontier was expected to defend the empire. But if the central ruler seemed ineffective, absent, or vulnerable, that same general could be hailed as the more practical emperor. Rome's military hierarchy and political hierarchy had fused, and once fused, each frontier command became a latent succession machine. Maximinus attempted to secure his rule through energetic campaigning and heavy extraction, especially because military loyalty had to be maintained. But his style of rule intensified alienation among elites and burdened the provinces. Therefore opposition widened. The empire was beginning to reveal a vicious cycle. Every emperor required military support to survive, but obtaining that support often damaged the broader political fabric needed to govern. In AD 238, the so-called Year of the Six Emperors demonstrated just how combustible the system had become. Rebellion in Africa, senatorial counteraction, military resistance, and competing claimants collided in rapid succession. Such episodes were not simply palace intrigue on a larger canvas. They were proof that the center of gravity in Roman politics had become unstable. Then came Decius, a ruler often remembered for severity, discipline, and an attempt to revive old Roman piety. His reign is deeply revealing because it shows the limits of moral restoration when structural pressures are strategic and fiscal. Decius sought to revive a sense of Roman order through sacrifice, tradition, and imperial seriousness. This was not absurd. States in crisis often reach for older symbols to stabilize present fear. But symbolism cannot substitute for secure frontiers, reliable manpower, and coherent command. Decius was trying to restore civic confidence by invoking the moral grandeur of Rome's past. But the dangers surrounding him belonged to a transformed military and geopolitical environment. His death at the Battle of Abrittus in AD 251 became one of the great symbolic ruptures of Roman history. A Roman emperor, fighting the Goths, was destroyed by a foreign enemy in battle. That fact echoed far beyond the battlefield itself. Rome had lost emperors before, certainly. But imperial authority depended not only on administrative function but on the aura of invincibility. An emperor could be assassinated by Romans and still fit within the brutal logic of internal politics. But an emperor annihilated by foreign enemies exposed something more frightening: the empire's external shield was no longer psychologically secure. Abrittus shattered the comforting belief that Rome could absorb frontier war without deep political trauma. Trebonianus Gallus followed, then Aemilian, each reign compressed by urgency. This compression is essential to understanding the crisis. Modern states can sometimes survive poor leadership because institutions continue operating with depth and redundancy. 3rd century Rome had institutions, certainly, but their effectiveness depended heavily on the emperor's ability to maintain military loyalty, distribute resources, respond rapidly to threats, and project confidence across immense distances. Therefore each short reign worsened the next. A new emperor inherited not only enemies but unpaid obligations, resentful armies, incomplete information, and provinces already learning to doubt promises from the center. This is where the strategic mechanics of the crisis become stark. Every civil war stripped troops from the frontier. Every frontier defeat empowered another general. Every new emperor had to pay for loyalty immediately. Every emergency debased currency and weakened confidence. Every province judged Rome less by law than by protection. That sequence is not a list of events. It is the engine of disintegration. Valerian and his son Gallienus eventually attempted a practical solution: divide responsibility. Valerian focused on the east, Gallienus on the west. On one level, this was intelligent adaptation. One ruler could not command the entire imperial chessboard effectively in real time. Therefore, shared dynastic command offered a way to maintain simultaneous pressure across multiple theaters. But every adaptation in a crisis also exposes hidden costs. To divide authority was to acknowledge the impossibility of undivided response. It worked only so long as coordination remained credible and loyalty remained vertical. Once communication failed, once perceptions of weakness spread, or once local commanders felt abandoned, divided command could look less like flexible governance and more like the first draft of partition. The East proved especially dangerous. The Sasanian king Shapur I was not merely raiding for plunder. He was pressing Roman weakness with strategic and ideological ambition. Persia under the Sasanians sought stature equal or superior to Rome's, and this sharpened the stakes of every campaign. Valerian's challenge was therefore immense. He needed to secure the eastern provinces, hold imperial prestige, and maintain enough wider stability that his absence would not invite catastrophe elsewhere. But plague, logistics, and pressure across multiple fronts had already weakened Roman capacity. Then came the disaster of AD 260. Valerian was captured alive by Shapur I. Few moments in Roman imperial history carried such destructive symbolic force. This was not merely a battlefield defeat. It was an intelligence failure, a logistical failure, and a catastrophe of image. An emperor was the living embodiment of Roman order. To lose one alive to a foreign monarch was to puncture the mythology that underwrote obedience from Britain to Syria. If the emperor himself could be taken, then Roman inevitability had been revealed as a story rather than a law of nature. The consequences were immediate and profound because image in imperial systems is never superficial. Power must be seen to exist before it can be obeyed across distance. Once the image cracks, local calculations change. Provincial elites begin asking not who is legitimate in theory, but who can actually protect cities, estates, trade, and families in practice. Frontier armies begin asking not who holds ceremonial superiority, but who can supply, lead, and win. This is the moment when emergency adaptation begins to shade into fragmentation. In the West, Postumus emerged and established what became known as the Gallic Empire, encompassing Gaul, and at times Britain and Hispania. This development should not be reduced to simple treason. Postumus was answering a real question that the central government had failed to answer convincingly: who would defend the Northwest? When regional communities face repeated danger and distant authority appears unreliable, local power acquires its own legitimacy. Therefore the Gallic Empire represented not just rebellion, but a regional solution to imperial failure. It maintained Roman forms, Roman language, Roman military structures. In other words, it was not anti-Roman in culture. It was Rome reorganized around effective security rather than distant legality. In the East, a parallel but distinct process unfolded around Palmyra. Originally a loyal and valuable partner city, Palmyra occupied a crucial strategic position linking Roman and Eastern worlds. After Valerian's capture, local initiative became indispensable. Odenathus of Palmyra acted in defense of Roman interests against Persia and achieved real successes. This initially strengthened the empire. But there is a brutal law in geopolitics: when the center outsources survival, it educates the periphery in sovereignty. Odenathus and, later, Zenobia demonstrated how local guardianship can evolve into quasi-imperial power. Once a regional actor organizes defense, revenue, military command, and prestige in its own name, dependence on the old center becomes psychologically and practically optional. Thus by AD 260 the Roman world no longer appeared indivisible. This is the pivot of the crisis. The danger was not one battle or one usurper or one plague wave in isolation. The danger was simultaneity. Gothic and other raiding networks exploited weakness across the Balkans and Aegean. Persia pressed in the east. The western provinces drifted under their own imperial center. The eastern provinces increasingly relied on Palmyrene strength. The central Roman government still existed, but it was beginning to resemble one claimant among several concentrations of Roman power. The empire was not merely under attack. It was being reorganized by stress. Gallienus, often underestimated in older narratives, deserves close attention here. He ruled in the midst of almost impossible conditions, and his decisions reveal that the crisis also generated innovation. With so many threats unfolding at once, static frontier methods were insufficient. Therefore Gallienus began developing stronger mobile forces able to respond more quickly to incursions and usurpations. He also increasingly marginalized senators from top military commands, elevating professional soldiers instead. This was not cosmetic reform. It was part of the early architecture of a new imperial order that would later become clearer under Diocletian and his successors. Yet reform in emergency comes at a political price. By excluding senators from senior military power, Gallienus weakened one old avenue of elite integration while strengthening the monarchy's direct reliance on professional military structures. This could improve effectiveness in the short term. But it also pushed Rome further from the older civic language of the Principate and closer to an openly militarized monarchy. The state was learning how to survive a harsher world. It was also becoming a different kind of state. That is why the 3rd century crisis must not be narrated as a descent into mere confusion. It was a period in which Rome discovered, under unbearable pressure, the hidden logic of its own system. The empire had long relied on expansion, prestige, and administrative habit to smooth over contradictions. But once expansion slowed, enemies hardened, disease spread, and civil war became recurrent, those contradictions emerged in full. A military monarchy dependent on army loyalty can function brilliantly when victories are frequent and resources abundant. But when threats multiply and information degrades, the same arrangement becomes a machine that rewards rapid mutiny, regional self-help, and fiscal cannibalization. The years between AD 251 and AD 260 therefore matter as the cascading decade in which crisis ceased to be episodic and became systemic. Abrittus destroyed Decius and the illusion of strategic absorbency. The plague reduced manpower and social confidence. Usurpers' offensives exposed eastern vulnerability. Valerian's capture detonated imperial prestige. Postumus offered a Western answer to failed protection. Palmyra became indispensable and therefore increasingly autonomous. Different theaters, different commanders, different calculations. But one empire drifting toward partition. At the heart of all this lay fog of war and human flaw. Leaders did not possess perfect maps of consequence. They acted under pressure, often with fragmentary information and little time. A commander who accepted acclamation as emperor might believe the central ruler had already failed and that only immediate seizure of authority could save the frontier. A provincial elite supporting local autonomy might judge that legal loyalty without security was a form of suicide. An emperor debasing currency to pay troops might understand perfectly well that confidence was being damaged, but conclude that unpaid soldiers posed a more immediate threat than future inflation. These were not irrational people in a vacuum. They were decision-makers inside a collapsing time horizon. The future kept shrinking, and with it the possibility of statesmanship. This is one of history's most enduring lessons. Systems rarely collapse because all participants suddenly become incompetent. They collapse because the incentive structure rewards choices that are individually sensible and collectively ruinous. Rome's usurpers were not merely mad opportunists. They were the predictable byproduct of an imperial machine that had fused military promotion with political sovereignty. And yet Rome did not die in the 3rd century. That fact is as important as the crisis itself. Near collapse is not the same as final collapse. The empire retained extraordinary reserves, administrative memory, urban wealth, military tradition, regional elites who still preferred Roman frameworks to total dissolution, and a capacity for adaptation that lesser polities would have lacked. This resilience appears in the emperors who followed. Claudius too, though his reign was brief, restored something precious: morale. Victories against Gothic threats mattered not only in tactical terms but in psychological ones. Morale in a political order under siege is itself a strategic resource. If soldiers believe recovery is possible, they fight differently. If cities believe the center can still punish enemies, they endure taxation differently. If elites believe the empire still has a future, they hesitate before choosing separatism. Therefore military success under Claudius too had effects beyond battlefield arithmetic. It began to reverse the emotional gravity of the crisis. But the great restorer was Aurelian. From AD 270 to AD 275, Aurelian accomplished what had recently looked impossible. He defeated external enemies, reconquered the Palmyrene East, crushed the independence of the Gallic Empire, and reassembled the Roman world under one ruler. Such achievements required speed, concentration of force, ruthless prioritization, and a level of command authority suited to a harsher age. Aurelian was not restoring the comfortable Rome of earlier centuries. He was constructing a viable Rome for a more dangerous world. Even his decision to build the Aurelian walls around Rome carries immense significance. For centuries, the city of Rome had existed under assumptions of security grounded in imperial dominance and distance from major threats. To wall Rome was to acknowledge that those assumptions were over. The old confidence had broken. The capital itself must now be defended in a more direct and visible way. Therefore recovery did not mean a return to innocence. It meant institutional acceptance that the empire's environment had permanently changed. Aurelian's reconquest of Palmyra and the Gallic Empire also illuminates a subtle truth. Fragmentation had not produced wholly alien states. It had produced Roman alternatives. The center was able to recover them partly because they still operated within Roman political language, military forms, and administrative habits. But this should not invite complacency. It simply shows how close Rome had come to becoming a family of successor empires while still using the same civilizational grammar. The empire survived because it could still recognize itself across fracture. Probus continued aspects of stabilization, but the deeper solution emerged only with Diocletian after AD 284. By then the lesson had become unmistakable. One emperor could not manage the whole chessboard alone. Therefore the later imperial system would distribute command more deliberately, harden bureaucracy, intensify taxation, and formalize the military monarchy that the crisis had exposed. This was not a betrayal of Rome. It was Rome adapting to realities it could no longer deny. Diocletian's transformations belong to a later chapter, but their roots lie in the 3rd century crisis. The Principate had long preserved a useful fiction of restrained monarchy cloaked in republican memory. The crisis stripped away that veil. Survival required clearer hierarchy, heavier administration, stronger regional command structures, and more direct extraction of resources. In effect, Rome saved itself by becoming more centralized, more militarized, and more openly autocratic. The state that emerged from the century's fires was tougher and more durable in some respects. But it was also less relaxed, less collegial in elite tone, and more demanding of society. This raises the great verdict of the age. The crisis proved that collapse was not inevitable. But survival carried a constitutional price. Rome endured, yet not as the same political creature. The old imperial balance, prestige, senatorial partnership, broad civic confidence, and military supremacy wrapped in elegant ambiguity, had been broken. What replaced it was a more explicit command state, forged by recurring emergency and legitimized by the memory of near disaster. Permanent emergency had not simply threatened the empire. It had rewritten the empire's character. The cost must be counted clearly. Count the dead from war and plague. Count the provinces stripped by taxation and raids. Count the cities left exposed while armies fought fellow Romans for imperial title. Count the currency debased, the confidence shattered, the loyalties narrowed from empire to region, from region to city, from city to commander. Count, above all, the political innocence lost. Rome had once presented itself as the guarantor of a universal peace. After the crisis, it increasingly understood itself as a fortress civilization under constant pressure, sustained by bureaucratic discipline and military readiness. The modern mirror of this history is unsettling because the mechanisms are painfully familiar. Large political orders rarely disintegrate in a single dramatic blow. More often, trust thins. Information degrades. Disease or economic shock reveals hidden weakness. Security becomes uneven. Elites begin hedging for local advantage. Emergency powers expand because the danger is real. But those same powers can deepen dependence on coercion, reduce institutional flexibility, and teach every faction to think first in terms of survival rather than continuity. The society remains standing. Yet the terms of belonging subtly change. Rome's 3rd century also warns against a common illusion: durability is not invulnerability. The empire had survived rebellions, assassinations, invasions, and fiscal strain before. Therefore many assumed it could survive anything in the same old form. But history is not a simple test of endurance. A state may outlive a crisis while losing the political habits that once made it admirable or coherent. Success in survival can conceal a quieter defeat in character. There is another lesson, colder still. States do not fail only from external pressure. They fail when internal incentive structures reward private advantage over shared continuity. In Rome, soldiers sought reliable pay, generals sought authority, provinces sought protection, elites sought local stability, emperors sought immediate survival. None of these motives was inherently absurd. But without trust in the center's capacity to bind sacrifice to a common future, rational actors began hollowing out the system that sheltered them. That is the deepest terror of political breakdown. It can be produced by ordinary calculation. The 3rd century crisis remains profoundly modern for this reason. Its central question is not ancient at all. How long can a vast political order endure when legitimacy, security, and truth stop reinforcing one another? When citizens no longer trust currency, when regions trust local protectors more than central institutions, when emergencies justify extraordinary powers year after year, when image and force diverge, and when the ruling system must spend ever more of its own future merely to survive the present. The crisis is no longer at the gates. The crisis has entered the architecture. Rome found a way through. But the way through required remaking the state into something sterner than what had entered the storm. That is the final grandeur and final warning of this age. Human societies are astonishingly resilient. They can reorganize under pressure, endure humiliation, improvise new structures, and recover from near-fatal disorder. But resilience does not guarantee restoration of what was lost. Sometimes a civilization survives by sacrificing its older self. The verdict, then, is neither simple decline nor triumphant recovery. It is transformation through ordeal. Rome fought itself because the system had made armed loyalty the language of sovereignty. It nearly shattered because every solution generated a new vulnerability. It endured because talented rulers exploited reserves of strength and rebuilt command on harsher foundations. The price of permanent emergency was not immediate extinction. The price was becoming a state permanently shaped by the memory of almost dying. And the legacy question remains, echoing beyond Rome and beyond antiquity. When a society saves itself through concentration, fear, and emergency adaptation, has it preserved its civilization? Or merely prolonged its power while the soul of the old order slips quietly away?